Hello and welcome to this edition of our special presentation on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States of America. It's been a power-packed few days in which the Prime Minister has attended various engagements in quick succession after the Quad Summit, the first in-person bilateral meeting with the President of the United States, Joe Biden. Close on the heels following he's arrived at New York. He is in his hotel now, and later today, he will be addressing the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. We'll be discussing all that and more with our reporters on the ground and our expert panel of guests over the next 2 hours. I'm Rukma with you, and with me is Preeti. A very good morning to you.
Morning, Rukma, and a warm morning to you too. Yes, for the past few days, we've been covering entire visit of the Prime Minister. We've been getting you inputs every second and every development out there in the US. The Prime Minister had an eventful and an important first leg of his tour to the US in Washington DC, and after that he is now in New York, and he will be addressing the 76th session of the UNGA. We'll keep you updated on that as well. What are the issues that are to be taken? How important is the session, and what lies ahead when we talk of India's participation at UNGA? We'll talk about that. Very quickly, let's get you a quick outlook on that. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as we told you, has reached New York from Washington DC, where he is scheduled to address at the 76th session of the UNGA later today. Now, this is Prime Minister Modi's second visit to the UNGA in about 2 years. Prime Minister Modi is expected to raise issues including COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine resilience. Prime Minister Modi is expected to speak on global recovery, reboot of global economy post the pandemic.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi touched down in New York City a short while back. He arrived at Lot New York Palace, where he was given a grand welcome. The Prime Minister met people as they cheered for him and chanted Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata Ki Jai outside the hotel in New York.
Moving down, guys, we're moving down. One day. One day.
And our correspondents, as we were telling you, will be bringing all the We'll be giving you all the updates as we connect to them. Joining us now is our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran. Ramesh, a very good morning to you once again. Give us a sense of the atmosphere as the Prime Minister reached his hotel in New York. We saw those visuals of members of the Indian community greeting him with chants of Vande Mataram.
Indeed, Rukma and Praveen, here on the podcast, it's become a tradition for Prime Minister Narendra Modi to miss the Indian diaspora every time it travels overseas. And it was no different this time as well here in New York City, where upon his arrival at his hotel here in the city, he was greeted by members of the Indian community, Indian Americans, and internationals as well. So this has become a regular feature. Travels abroad, 4 million Americans here West are an African society and become a force to reckon with in American politics. They occupy positions in politics, academia. So they are an affluent section of the community. As we visit of Prime Minister New York a couple of hours ago, and as we were saying, screens the Indian New York. So, now optics and the constitution of this visit is well, and and Prime Minister here at 9 evening on PM in Delhi.
All right, Ramesh, talking of this session, yes, when we're talking of this special session, the 76th session of the UNGA, which the Prime Minister will be addressing. Now, this is not for the first time that the Prime Minister will be addressing the UNGA. But talking of the priorities or talking of what all is to be taken up, I would want you to delve more into that. Or before that, very quickly, let's show our viewers the special report which you sent us from New York, wherein you clock all the buzz from Ground Zero in New York ahead of Prime Minister's address to the UNGA. Let's take a look at this special report.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is among the 100-odd world leaders who will address the United Nations General Assembly's 76th session here at the UN building right behind me in New York. Now, this would be his second visit to the UNGA in about 2 years. The last time he spoke at the UNGA was in 2019, the year he was re-elected for a second term in office. Now, among the issues the PM can be expected to raise in his address here at the UNGA include COVID-19 pandemic, vaccines. Remember, India decided to resume supply of vaccines to the needy countries in the region and beyond.
There's no doubt that combating COVID-19 is right on top of the agenda of the UN General Assembly. And this is particularly so because many of the developing countries have not had any equitable access to vaccine. On the question of combating climate change, once again, India has been at the forefront of climate action. And as you know, we are the only country in the G20 which has got a credible pathway to achieve the Paris targets. And I think this is once again widely recognized. And we will therefore be pushing for climate action.
The issue of global recovery, economic recovery or reboot of the global economy from the pandemic, and also supply chain resilience. Now, this is an issue of immense importance to India because many countries around the world have had an over-dependence on China during the pandemic, and that's had a devastating impact on many economies around the world. Also, multilateral reforms of the UN in particular, and the UN Security Council as well. Remember, India is among the handful of countries, including Germany, Japan and Brazil, who are actually pushing for UNSC reform as quickly as possible.
On the question of combating terrorism, I mean, you know very well, we have been probably one of the strongest proponents of combating terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. And when the discussion on the global counter-terror strategy took place a couple of months ago, once again, India's contribution was extremely important in shaping the contours of counter-terrorist strategy. And we took a very active part. And also in the Security Council, we are members of the Security Council. Right. And we have taken a lead in this particular direction. And therefore, I think this once again will be right at the top of our agenda.
So these are some of the issues that the PM can be expected to raise in his address here at the UNGA come Saturday, 25th September. I'm Ramesh Ramatan with my camera person Saurabh Shukla in New York for DD India.
All right, so that was the special report by our correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran from New York. At this juncture, we are welcoming Mr. Prabhu Dayal. He's former senior diplomat into the show, and we will be talking more with him about Prime Minister's visit to the US. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on DD India this morning. To begin with, I would want you to evaluate for us the first leg of Prime Minister's visit to the US. He's had important engagements from the first in-person bilateral meeting with the president there, to the participation in the first in-person Quad meeting, and also he had fruitful and eventful discussions with the CEOs there in Washington. How do you sum up the first leg of Prime Minister's visit to the US?
Well, the Prime Minister's visit has commenced very well and has progressed very well till now. There is no doubt about it. His meetings with US leaders, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, have gone on extremely well, and issues which are very pertinent for the growth of bilateral relations were discussed between the two sides. I would also attach a lot of importance to Prime Minister's meetings with the 5 CEOs, because our Prime Minister has been very focused in drawing investment into India in future technologies, and all the 5 CEOs were from companies which are involved in such technologies. So I think that the visit has progressed on the lines that we wanted it to. Now, as regards the discussions with the President of the United States, well, we were able to highlight our concerns, and I think that the discussions which were confidential and private between the two sides certainly would have focused on our concerns in the region of South Asia due to the changed situation in Afghanistan and the role which Pakistan has been playing there, because Pakistan has been a part of the problem in Afghanistan, while the Americans thought that they could use Pakistan's support in the context of Afghanistan and considered Pakistan as a part of the solution. So I'm sure that we had some frank speaking with the US side, and our point of view must have been appreciated. I would also like to say that the concerns about China are shared by both sides. We, of course, have been having a long-standing face-off with China across the line of actual control. But the US is also deeply worried about Chinese expansionism. So the role that the two countries want the Quad to play would have been discussed. Then there are issues like trade and investment. There are trade issues which are difficult to resolve. I think, for instance, relating to the GSP or the tariffs which were introduced by the Trump administration. I do not know what really has been the outcome of the discussions in this regard, but we expect that a trade pact could be signed by the two sides in due course. In fact, our Minister of Commerce has already said that most of the difficulties which existed in the way of signing of such a pact have been eliminated, they have been sorted out, and there is really a need for a trade agreement to be signed. Of course, there are issues relating to COVID, because the global situation has been extremely disturbed. India and the United States have both been very badly affected by the COVID pandemic. But at the same time, we have cooperated with each other and have appreciated the role which the two countries are playing in regard to the COVID pandemic. So I think all these issues are extremely pertinent in today's context, and discussions between the two sides were very necessary and very useful.
Right. Well, Prabhu Dayal, will be coming back to you. We also have with us our correspondent who is in New York and covering the entire leg of this leg of the Prime Minister's journey. Ramesh, coming back to you, when we talk about, you were telling us about the various aspects that the Prime Minister could touch upon in his address at the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. He's also talked in his talks with President Biden, there was also the mention of COVID resilience. So resilient supply chains and COVID resilience, what do we understand and what could be the way ahead? What role could India play in this in the days to come?
Well, Rukma, if we look at Prime Minister Modi's engagements in Washington, D.C. And looking ahead to his intervention at the UNGA come 9 a.m. here on Saturday, there is a recurring and common theme in all of his engagements with his interlocutors, be it Biden or his the leaders of the Quad member states. There are some issues which cannot be tackled by India alone. It needs to work in collaboration with other countries, and such issues include, for instance, climate change and COVID-19 pandemic. And in the last several hours, we've heard from both principals in the case of India and the US that India in particular has decided and announced
that it will resume supply of vaccines to the needy countries in the Indo-Pacific. Why did this happen? Because after in fact, when the second wave of the pandemic hit India, India in its wisdom decided to stop the export of vaccines and focus on domestic needs. But since then, we've heard from the highest levels of the Indian government that India will once again resume supply of vaccines come October, and that has been well received by many countries around the world, including the US and the Quad member states. Climate change is another multilateral global challenge which requires collaborative efforts, and towards that end, between now and the COP26 summit, which will take place in Glasgow, Scotland, in the UK in November, India, by the way, is one of those few countries which are on course to meet their voluntary national commitments under the Paris Climate Accord. But after his talks here in the US, Prime Minister Modi has said that India will also help bring down the net zero emissions, which was not the case so far. So clearly India, in agreement with the Quad member states, including the US, that climate action is urgently required, and India is willing to walk the extra mile, so to speak, in that direction. At the same time, there were very other bilateral issues such as trade and investment, people-to-people ties, some of which might still be outstanding. But the fact remains that this was an occasion for both principals, Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, to get to know each other, because this was their first in-person meeting in spite of the ongoing pandemic. And that, to my mind, is very significant. And Ambassador Dayal would bear me out when I say that personal meeting, a personal touch, cannot be substituted in the world of diplomacy. So this was essential for both leaders to get to know each other, understand where each other is coming from, and to share their perspectives, visions, and priorities. So between now and the end of their respective terms, India and the US would have actually and verifiably transformed their bilateral ties.
All right, I'll take that forward to Mr. Dayal. Mr. Dayal, when we are talking of participation of the countries, then US, when we talk of US participation at Quad, at UNGA, or for that matter, even bilaterally with India, then President Biden takes on the reins of administration in the US. Added to that, there has been a lot that has been said about the troops withdrawal from Afghanistan. Added to that, he's also got, not only he, in fact, all the countries are still grappling with the pandemic. So put these domestic challenges back home. How far do these challenges or these domestic events have a bearing on, on how US, in fact, participates in global platforms, in groupings which are of global importance?
Well, the United States is the leading global power, and it shoulders a great deal of responsibility in the conduct of diplomatic relations with other countries. But recently the United States image has taken a battering on account of the unplanned and unseemly withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. There has been a lot of criticism internationally and also domestically on the Biden administration for the manner in which the US troops were withdrawn, leading to total chaos in Afghanistan. So I think there is a lot of background disturbance for some reason.
No, sir, please continue. No, we can hear you, sir. Please continue.
All right. No, so I was saying that the United States therefore needs to repair the damage done to its image. And it needs to realize that Pakistan has been a part of the problem, as I said earlier. Now, the talks between our Prime Minister and President Biden did focus on this issue, according to what I have come across in media reports, and both sides expressed concern over Pakistan's role in Afghanistan and its involvement in terrorism. This was done bilaterally as well as in the Quad summit, according to what I have picked up in the media reports. I'm not privy to what happened firsthand. Now, I think that there has to be a rethinking of American policy in regard to Pakistan, because Pakistan was needed as long as US troops were there in Afghanistan for sending supplies across, but now the situation has changed. America can and should act a little more tough with Pakistan and think of the steps which can be taken globally to check the nurseries of terrorism.
Yes.
And the big state actors, state-helped, state-financed actors within Pakistan, like the Jaish-e-Mohammed, like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Haqqani network, all these operate from Pakistani territory. Now the dangers are that if international pressure is put on Pakistan, then these would shift their bases across in Afghanistan. And Pakistan would say, look, everything is hunky-dory here. So there has to be very close monitoring of what is going on both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And these are issues which must have been discussed between the two sides, because the threat of terrorism has not gone anywhere. In fact, it has only increased. So to me, this would be the most important aspect as regards our regional situation. Of course, along with the role which China continues to play, which is very mischievous. China has already shown that it is expansionist in nature. And now the sort of situation which arises in Afghanistan is giving China greater opportunities to align with Pakistan and play a very, very harmful role. Harmful for our interests and also perhaps for those of the United States. While other Quad members may not be so directly affected, but they have to take stock of the fact that terrorism can hit anywhere, and nobody is immune from the dangers of terrorism. So at the Quad meeting also, which Ramesh Ramachandran referred to, the discussions were very substantive, and according to media reports, the very fact that the Afghanistan issue and the role of Pakistan were discussed is significant in itself.
Right. We are also joined by our expert, our second expert for this special presentation, Dr. Anshu Joshi, Professor, Center for Canadian, US and Latin American Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, we just heard what Prabhu Dayal has said about the main focus as far as India is concerned during these high-level meetings that the Prime Minister is holding in the United States. Terrorism, radicalism, even before he left for the US, these were the points he highlighted, although he did add other points like transfer of technology, science, and but when we talk about these issues, Afghanistan, terrorism, radicalism, your thoughts on their significance, their importance in these sessions that the Prime Minister is having?
Indeed, it is, now I cannot say going to be a very important theme. It is a very important theme for all these big bilateral relations between India and Australia, India and Japan, India and US. I mean the Quad members, or the multilateral partnership that is emerging from the platform of Quad. The crisis that has emerged recently because of Afghanistan and what Taliban has done there is a key focus now for not only the Quad members, but for the entire world. That is something we need to understand. And see, our Prime Minister has very clearly mentioned the same thing in his recent speech at SCO Summit, that the Indians are not going to tolerate terrorism in any form, at any cost, not only in India, but at the global level. And India and United States of America have already initiated a global war on terror, and we already have some MOUs and some partnerships and some agreements in place. And looking that from the crisis that has emerged in Afghanistan, we need to take now all these, agreements to the global level. And that will happen from the platform of Quad. And that will also happen from the platform of United Nations General Assembly. Because we all need to understand one thing, that we cannot accept any terrorist organization like Taliban as a government at any cost. Because Taliban is now looking for the acceptance from the global community in terms of political power, and it is taking help of countries like Pakistan and China in achieving the same. But we all understand that once we give acceptance to this kind of terrorist power, it will indeed become a very critical threat for global peace and security. So I see Afghanistan crisis from a comprehensive manner. I also see Pakistan emerging as a threat for the world through Taliban and what is happening in Afghanistan today. I also see China emerging as a threat, especially in looking at the free Indo-Pacific region. So what is happening in Afghanistan would impact multiple domains related to world peace and security tomorrow, and hence it is going to be a very, very critical theme to be discussed and sorted out during these bilateral meetings of our Prime Minister and multilateral meetings from the platform of Quad and United Nations General Assembly.
All right, I'll take that forward to our correspondent Ramesh. Dr. Joshi has has in fact explained in detail about how crucial these topics are for the UNGA and how it is important for peace and stability to be maintained in the region. When we talk of UNGA as a forum, talk more about its significance. International world comes together to discuss international issues, but how, when we talk of some fruitful or some concrete decisions to be made, how important is this forum for discussing, important issues like terrorism, stability in regions, and also when we talk of global economy, pandemic, a lot of issues up the sleeves of the leaders when they discuss and they deliberate. But talking of the significance of UNGA as a platform, explain it to our viewers.
Well, Preeti, just to give a sense to our viewers joining us from India and around the world, as we speak, we have only one world body, which is the United Nations. So there is no practical or probable substitute for the UN, but the fact remains, as India says, there is scope for reform of the United Nations to reflect contemporary realities, such that countries such as India can play a more meaningful and influential and consequential role in managing global affairs. Now, that said, since you are referring to the UNGA, it's been a constant refrain on the part of India to sensitize and make the world community aware of India's aspirations, in the sense that there is a widespread belief in India today and for quite some time now that India deserves a rightful place around the horseshoe table in the United Nations Security Council. Now, that's the top executive organ or body of the United Nations, which perhaps to the dismay of many countries, including India, does not really reflect the contemporary realities of the world we live in. And India believes, by virtue of being the world's largest democracy, by virtue of having the economic and political heft, India deserves to be seated around that horseshoe table in the UN Security Council. And to that end, India has joined ranks and made efforts jointly with other like-minded countries, such as Japan, such as Brazil and Germany. Together they form the Group of Four, which is pushing for reform of the United Nations in general and the UN Security Council in particular. Now, that said, in Prime Minister Modi's address, if you look at the past, and if the past is any indicator, he can be expected to focus on multilateral reform as well in his address. Because if you look at what he spoke last year on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, he spoke about what India calls it reformed multilateralism, whereby India is pushing for UN reform in general and UNSC expansion in particular. Now, to that end, India also believes that because of the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, UN bodies such as the World Health Organization could also do well with some kind of reform. So all in all, it's going to be a consequential intervention by the Prime Minister when he speaks from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. In addition to that, Preeti, just to give our viewers a sense of the issues that he could be raising in his address, COVID pandemic is one issue, as well as climate change, and above all, counter-terrorism. And just to take off on the point Ambassador Dayal was making, and Dr. Joshi as well, in the context of security, Prime Minister could directly or indirectly touch upon issues such as Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, Afghanistan, because of the situation of things there, where proscribed terrorists have come to occupy positions of influence in Kabul, much to the disappointment of democracies around the world, including India. And India believes, as Foreign Secretary Shringla said in Washington, D.C., he believes that Pakistan's continued support of the Taliban and similar ideological, fellow travelers is not conducive to global expectations. And the consensus, in his words, a clear sense in the Quad was that Pakistan must be monitored for its actions going forward, so that Afghanistan does not pose a threat to India or any other neighboring country in that region. And so Pakistan and Afghanistan will likely fail in his address as well.
Right. Coming to you, Ambassador Dayal, we've already heard your thoughts on Afghanistan, how India is concerned. A prime concern is that it will be used as a terror hub. We'd also like to hear your thoughts on this issue as well. India's membership of Quad, India's role as a member of Quad, its participation in various exercises and various forums and sessions, and reforms in the United Nations, more specifically a seat at the horseshoe table in the Security Council.
Well, let me address the second issue first. The question of UN Security Council reform and a seat as a permanent member there. You know, the difficulties are real, and they are in the form of objections which the current permanent members raise to the inclusion of other countries as permanent members. China, for one, stands opposed to India's becoming a permanent member. So, while the difficulties do exist, this does not mean that our quest has to be given up, because India has every right to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. You would recall that in his UNGA address last year, Prime Minister had emphasized in great detail the reasons why India's case is so strong. India is the world's largest democracy. It has made such a substantial contribution to UN peacekeeping efforts. It has done so much in terms of COVID management, its vaccine diplomacy, and a host of other reasons which make India highly qualified to sit at the horseshoe table as a permanent member. Now, as I said, there are difficulties. For one thing, those who are already permanent members are little obstructionist when it comes to allowing somebody else to come in. It's an exclusive club, and they have privileges and perks. Above all, they have the veto power. It was even suggested that new permanent members could be introduced without a veto power, but even on that there is no unanimity. Now, let's talk about the Quad, which was the other issue which you referred to. You know, there are suggestions being made that now with the setting up of this new military alliance between the US, UK and Australia, AUKUS as it is being called, Quad has lost its relevance. I don't think so. India never was interested in seeing the Quad as a military formation. In fact, we were very consistent in clarifying that there is no military dimension to Quad. Of course, there are Malabar exercises now being conducted by all the 4 Quad members since last year when Australia also joined. And there have been suggestions that because the Malabar exercises involve all the Quad members, therefore Quad has a military dimension. That is not so. Our government has been quite strenuously pointing out that there is absolutely no military dimension to Quad, and that we are seeing it as a facilitator of global good. The Prime Minister stressed in his recent remarks that Quad can play the role of imparting good to the world, welfare, global welfare, whether it is in the context of climate change or COVID, or keeping the marine sea routes open, ensuring marine security. Now, let me emphasize that last month in August, when India held the presidency of the UN Security Council, there were 3 main themes which were addressed by us. Prime Minister himself spoke on maritime security on 9th August. Subsequently, the External Affairs Minister spoke on counter-terrorism and UN peacekeeping. So these are very important issues from India's point of view. So apart from the big question of UN reform, and in particular UN Security Council reform, which will not go away during any speech that India makes in the UN General Assembly, because these are matters which are extremely important, and whether or not the achievements are going to come very quickly, we have no doubt that ultimately India will sit at the high table as a permanent member. So unless we try, we are not going to achieve. There are impediments, there are obstacles, I agree. It's a very difficult objective to realize. But should we give it up? I don't think we should. And the inequities in the international system, particularly in the context of permanent membership of the UN Security Council, do need to be iterated and reiterated time and again. That is what India has been doing.
Yes, I'll take that forward to Dr. Joshi. Dr. Joshi, sir has talked of, the areas of concern for India at the UNGA and also Quad. Now, time and again, it has been reiterated that we need to have a secure and a free Indo-Pacific. For the benefit of our viewers, explain to us the importance of Indo-Pacific as a region. We have Quad on one side, we also have AUKUS on one side, there is also talk of Quad Plus, or in fact a Quad Plus Plus. So that, definitely throws some light on how important the region is, not only for, the respective countries, but also, for the world as a whole. Spell out more on this, please.
See, basically, when you look at the Indo-Pacific region geopolitically and geostrategically, it is of critical importance to world politics in different manners. And it is also known as a region of economic importance. It is also known as Indo-Pacific Asia, and it comprises the tropical waters, if you see, of the Indian Ocean, the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, and seas connecting the two in the general areas of Indonesia. So, as a definition, if you look at the particular area, this is the area. And through this area, basically, the north part connects with the southern part of the world. That we have to understand. And that's the reason China has a special interest in controlling this particular area, and it has been doing this for past couple of years by applying different diplomatic tactics, direct and indirect exercises. So if you go back and see the string of pearl strategy of China, it's all about taking a control over this particular region. And China has So what is that strategy? Through this strategy, China tries to acquire ports of, countries like Sri Lanka and the other, countries located in this region, and then in the name of development, it just takes over the ports, and then finally it just takes the control of the entire port eventually. So it has already done that with Hambantota port. Now it has also taken Gwadar port of Pakistan to do the same thing. And because China is doing all these exercises to control this particular region, it not only poses a serious direct security threat to the countries associated with this region, it's also related to the economic strategies and economic progress of the nations involved. That's the reason Prime Minister Morrison is also concerned about keeping this region free from any influence. That's the reason Japanese Prime Minister also expressed his concern to keep this region free of any influence. That's the reason US is also concerned about, although US is situated far, in northern part of the globe, it is also concerned about this region, and India especially is concerned about this, region. And through the platform of Quad, it has been a key, it has been a key objective to keep Indo-Pacific region free of any influence, any political influence, any military influence, any direct or indirect influence, because it's important for the global economy, global trade, and security of entire world.
Right. Well, let's listen in to the joint statement from Quad leaders.
And up your screens, we have the details of the joint statement from the Quad leaders.
A free and open Indo-Pacific, which is also inclusive and resilient. Just 6 months have passed since our last meeting. These were some of the statements that were made as part of the joint statement. Since March, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused continued global suffering. Climate change is also mentioned, and cooperation, however, remains unflinching, say the Quad leaders. Quad Summit is an opportunity to refocus ourselves and the world on the Indo-Pacific, on our vision for what we hope to achieve. This is part of the joint statement of Quad leaders. And on this historic occasion, we recommit to our partnership and to a region that is a bedrock of our shared security and prosperity. A free and open Indo-Pacific, which is also inclusive and resilient. Just 6 months have passed since our last meeting. Since March, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused continued global suffering. The climate crisis has accelerated and regional security has become ever more complex, testing all of our countries individually and together. Our cooperation, however, remains unflinching. The occasion of the Quad Summit is an opportunity to refocus ourselves and the world on the Indo-Pacific and on our vision for what we hope to achieve. Together, we recommit to promoting the free, open, rules-based order rooted in international law and undaunted by coercion to bolster security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
All right, so that was the gist of the joint statement put forth by the leaders after the Quad meeting. And just a while back, one of our guests also put into perspective for us how important is Quad not only for the region but also for the entire world as a whole. Coming back to UNGA, when we talk of the priorities or the areas of concern for UNGA, Ramesh, talk more about, we're also talking of reforms at the UN. Now, India has been a founding member, and India has had a long association with the UN, so much so that now it is vying for a permanent seat at the UNSC. And it's not just India, but other countries are also, there are in fact other countries also which are vying for a permanent seat at the UNSC. Spell out more and explain to our viewers the reforms that are expected to be taken up, or that that are intended to be taken up at the UN.
Right, Preeti, if you permit me, I will come to the UNGA component in just a bit. Since we spoke about the joint statement issued towards the end of the Quad Leaders Summit, may I, just for the benefit of our viewers, try to, as simply as one can, explain the issues at hand here.
Yes, please continue.
If you look at the text of the joint statement, there is no mention of the word China, number one. Now, that said, if you look at the subtext of the joint statement and the context of it, it is a nuanced take on the affairs of the Indo-Pacific. The subtext undoubtedly is the elephant in the room, namely China. The context, on the other hand, is China's recent attitude or disposition against some of its neighbors in the ASEAN and the wider Indo-Pacific region, including India. Now, that said, India is very clear on one count. The Quad is not against any one country. Rather, it is for something. It stands for some values. And India has made it very clear from the outset that a large part of the direction that Quad moves ahead will be determined in some part by China's attitude going forward as well. So the ball is clearly in a Chinese court. If China continues to provoke its neighbors, such as India or the ASEAN countries, then consequences might follow. Now, that said, if you look at the impact, if any, of the AUKUS grouping on the Quad, to my mind, it opens up possibilities for India. Why do I say that? Because if the AUKUS is well and truly a defense and security pact among the three countries, the UK, the US, and Australia, it opens up possibilities for India, for instance, to turn towards other countries who have interests or stake in the Indo-Pacific region, namely Japan and also France. Now, that said, the Prime Minister himself mentioned in so many words that the intent of India and its like-minded partners is to leverage each other's strengths. Now, every country among the Quad members has certain attributes or strengths, and Prime Minister Modi, who once says, he said it in so many words, that one can leverage those strengths for the common good of the world, the region at large. Now, a good example of that is the Quad vaccine. Why do I say that? Because India, as a Quad member, has the production capacity. Australia has distribution network, and Japan, for instance, has the funding capability. So when all these attributes come together, Quad vaccine supplies become that much more easier and affordable for the needy countries in the Indo-Pacific region. One last point, Preeti, on the Quad. If you look at the composition of the Quad, there are 4 countries, but 3 of them are what is known as treaty allies.
Yes.
The Australians and the Japanese are treaty allies of the US, but not India. So there is an asymmetry here, and to my mind, India is very clear from the word go, from the word get-go, that this is not a containment policy or a military alliance. This is 4 democracies coming together for the common good, to act as a force for good. And as PM himself mentioned, the Quad will work for peace and security, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also across the world. Now, coming to the UNGA very quickly, Preeti, as I mentioned before, that a lot is at stake at the multilateral level. And as we've been reporting here on TD India in our coverage of PM's visit to the USA, a lot is at stake insofar as multilateral negotiations are concerned with respect to climate action, with respect to COVID-19 pandemic, with respect to multilateral reform. A good example of India's contribution, Preeti, is the fact, as you mentioned correctly, that India has had a long association with the UN dating back to 1942 and 45, years before India actually became independent. And India is a founding member of the UN. And to that end, we've seen India make a number of contributions over the decades. A good example of that is the peacekeeping operations or the peacekeeping efforts. Now, our viewers, this might interest our viewers, India is among the largest troop contributing member of the UN, and unfortunately, it has come at a heavy price. India has lost 100 odd service personnel in the line of duty in peacekeeping operations across the world. Another important initiative in 2017 by Prime Minister Modi for the setting up of what is known as the India-UN Development Partnership Fund. Now, in the initial corpus, India contributed $100 million for the development effort of projects to be undertaken at the request of the 193 UN member states. And later, India allocated a $50 million extra specifically for the Commonwealth countries. So this has come as a huge impetus to meet the development needs of the certain UN member states who are in requirement, who need funding to carry out infrastructure projects in their respective countries. So all in all, India is a valuable member of the UN. And as we've been saying here on DD India, India is pushing for reform of the UN in general and UN Security Council in particular, because India, as Ambassador Dayal himself said, deserves a rightful place in the UN Security Council. Given the fact that India is the world's largest democracy, it has the political heft, economic heft to influence the affairs of the world, and India is pushing for that for the last many decades. Unfortunately, there's been no consensus on it because the draft negotiations are still a work in progress. The intergovernmental negotiations are they're dilatory tactics adopted by some countries who do not favor the expansion Security Council. So things are at a very delicate stage as we speak, but India remains optimistic of making headway going forward.
Right. We've already asked this of Ambassador Dayal. Anshu, we'd like your thoughts on this. The message that has gone out from the first leg of the Prime Minister's visit, how would you sum up all the various events in a few words?
See, the stage was already set with the recent developments that had happened at the arena of world politics, be it the shadow of COVID-19 or be it the Afghanistan crisis that happened just before this visit, and the threat that has been posed by jihadi terror organizations like Taliban now in front of entire world to be to look at. Now, if you look at this trip in particular, our Prime Minister went with certain goals that cannot be seen only at the unilateral level of India, that have been the goals for other countries as well, from the bilateral relationships point of view, be it India-Japan partnership, be it India-Australia relationship, be it India-United States of America relationship, be it the platform of Quad, or be it United Nations General Assembly at the end. Day before yesterday, we all saw how Morrison and Modi ji met warmly, and various issues and collective objectives were discussed and agreed upon. So, for example, Australia and India would keep working in the area of promoting their trade relationship, not only from bilateral point of view, but keeping all the Quad nations also into it. And hence we can see that that was a key area of discussion between Japanese Prime Minister and our Prime Minister also, in terms of preparing well to combat epidemics like COVID-19. So be it strengthening the vaccination program, or be it strengthening our technologies to help in coming up with comprehensive civil defense mechanism against such kind of diseases, or dealing up with the challenges, economic challenges that have emerged because of this COVID-19 pandemic. All these issues were discussed between Morrison and Modi, then Suga and Modi, and finally, and yes, one more very important event, when our Prime Minister met the CEOs of 5 reputed companies, and they all agreed to work collectively. In fact, for example, the CEO of Qualcomm expressed his willingness to help India in developing 5G technology and strengthening the already existing digital technologies and so on. And other CEOs also have come up to help India in working in the area of green technologies, sustainable technologies, solar energy, 5G technology, digital platforms, and so on. So that was a key event that happened day before yesterday.
Right,
and then finally, when he met Kamala Harris, again, the objectives that have been set between US and India as a bilateral relationships were re-strengthened, and the same were discussed yesterday when President Biden met our Prime Minister Modi. And similar things were discussed from the platform of Quad. Now I'm willing to see what happens at the stage of United Nations General Assembly, because I am looking at major reforms to happen in United Nations General Assembly, as in particular, and United Nations as a whole.
Right, Anshu, as you said, all eyes on the Prime Minister's address to the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly later in the day. Many thanks to you, Ambassador Dayal, also Anshu Joshi and Professor Joshi, and also Ramesh, our correspondent. Ramesh, you keep your eyes on that story. We'll be back with you throughout the day for more.
All right, so that was it when we talk of Prime Minister's engagement in Washington DC, and also what is to be expected to be taken up at the UNGA in New York. The Prime Minister is in New York and he will be addressing the 76th session of the UNGA. We've still got 1 more hour to keep you abreast with the Prime Minister's visit. Up next, we're heading for a short break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a short while.
Namaste India.
Namaste land.
Marhaban ila al-Hind. Zari India. Salam India.
Namaste India.
Namaskar Bharata.
Mui India.
Nahnu
Hunud. India.
Ma Hindi Hasti. Mung Hindian.
Salam Hindustan.
We are India.
Your window to rising India. India's voice on global platforms. Latest news from India and around the world. In-depth analysis of global headlines. Watch DD India in your country. Available for downlink in all Southeast Asian countries. STTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 17 at 93.5 degrees east. HDTV broadcast is available through the satellite GSAT 10 at 83 degrees east. For technical details, scan here. Switch to DD India now. As the day unfolds and news and events take shape, we get you complete coverage of every news breaking in, tracking new developments as they happen. Midday Prime English, Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. on DD India.
Welcome back after the break. You're watching DD India. I'm Preeti, with me is Rukma, and we welcome you again to this special edition, Prime Minister's Visit to the USA, a program we're getting for you wherein we are tracking each and every event which is being planned and which is being held in the US. When we talk of Prime Minister's Visit to the US, we were joined in by guests, and we've been showing you reports from Ground Zero in the US, tracking all the events which the Prime Minister had in Washington DC and what is to be expected when the Prime Minister addresses the 76th session of the UNGA today, later in the day.
Right. Well, as Preeti said, the Prime Minister in the United States, all eyes on his address at the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. Already we are getting various indications of the aspects he could touch on from his various meetings, those high-level meetings. It's been a jam-packed, in fact power-packed few days ever since he arrived in Washington DC. From his meeting with the CEOs, top honchos of various companies, also with Vice President of the US, Kamala Harris, and then concluding with Quad. And just before that, well, there was his bilateral meet with the US President. We'll be discussing all that and more. But first, let's take a look at the joint statement from the Quad leaders, which says, on this historic occasion, we recommit to our partnership and to a region that is a bedrock of our shared security and prosperity, a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is also inclusive and resilient. Just 6 months have passed since our last meeting. Since March, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused continued global suffering. The climate crisis has accelerated and regional security has become ever more complex, testing all of our countries individually and together. Our cooperation, however, remains unflinching. The occasion of the Quad Summit is an opportunity to refocus ourselves and the world on the Indo-Pacific and on our vision for what we hope to achieve. Together, we recommit to promoting the free, open, rules-based order rooted in international law and undaunted by coercion to bolster security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We stand for the rule of law, freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful resolution of disputes, democratic values and territorial integrity of states. We commit to work together and with a range of partners. We reaffirm our strong support for ASEAN's unity and centrality and for ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. We underscore our dedication towards working with ASEAN and its member states, the heart of the Indo-Pacific region, in practical and inclusive ways. We also welcome the September 2021 EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific.
All right, how has been the visit till now, and what does the day ahead holds for India's participation at the UNGA? We will be talking about that. We're joined in by Mr. Anil Wadhwa, he's former senior diplomat. We're joined in by Mr. Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, and Mr. Subimal Bhattacharjee, cyber security and IT expert. We will be interacting with all three of them. Thank you so much for joining in on DD India when we talk of Prime Minister's visit to the US. To begin with, first I will go across to Mr. Wadhwa. Mr. Wadhwa, important engagements of the Prime Minister in the US, when we specifically talk of the joint statement after the Quad meeting. The joint statement does not at any point refer to China. The countries have talked of collaboration, the countries have talked of cooperation, the countries have talked of a free and secure Indo-Pacific region. But no particular country has been pointed out, and also the COVID pandemic has also found a lot of coverage in the Quad meeting. To begin with, I would want you to evaluate the first in-person Quad meeting between the leaders of these four countries that was held yesterday.
So I think, as expected, the first in-person Quad meeting had an expanded agenda. We had three focused working groups which were set up at the first virtual meeting of the summit meeting of the Quad in March. And we saw the results that have come about since then. In the last 6 months, the working groups have been meeting quite regularly. And obviously, in the three areas of COVID and global health and climate, as well as in critical and emerging technologies, we've seen a fleshing out of what work has been done. First of all, in terms of COVID and global health, it's now very clear, the figures are out in terms of the number of doses that will be rolled out, 1 billion doses by 2022. The loans by Japan of $3.3 billion for the Indo-Pacific for the vaccine purchases. And similarly, a loan from JICA for India for biological E for $100 million. Then, of course, the rollout sums by Australia, which have also been spelled out for $400 odd million in the Indo-Pacific. So all this adds up to a very comprehensive plan, and that is going to be counted as a big success for the Quad. Secondly, in terms of climate, obviously the working groups have linked the targets now to 2030, but there is much more, which is the setting up of a green shipping network, the green ports and infrastructure group, the Quad shipping task force, which has been spelled out, green hydrogen partnership has been spelled out, and of course the resilience and preparedness response, specifically keeping into mind the islands of the Western Pacific. And finally, in critical and emerging technologies, one very important development of technical standards contact group which has been set up, plus the semiconductor supply chain initiative is a major development, and of course the 5G development and diversification, a monitoring group for biotechnology, etc., etc. In addition to that, we now have an emphasis on cybersecurity. A specific group which will talk about a senior group for cybersecurity has been set up, and a new element which will reinforce the maritime security aspect is that of a space working group with sharing of satellite data and helping not only in mapping of the oceans, but at the same time helping with any other ways and means in which the Quad countries can further their interests together. And that's a euphemism for intelligence sharing, in my view. And going forward, it's going to be very important as a separate group. All in all, a very comprehensive statement, a fleshing out of ideas, And now it remains to be seen how the Quad takes this forward.
Right. Well, many aspects to the joint statement, very comprehensive is what our guest has said. Mr. Bansal, your thoughts on the Quad joint statement, the positivity in the language, the affirmativeness, how would you describe it?
See, I think the Quad statements includes all the essential ingredients. It talks about vaccine, it talks about COVID, it talks about climate change, it talks about regional security without naming anyone. And that was what was expected from this Quad summit, being the first summit of the heads of this government of these 4 countries. And it comes at a time when US needed to reassure its allies that it's a reliable ally, because what happened in Afghanistan and subsequently what happened by way of AUKUS had raised a serious question mark on Quad, because there were certain queries as to why AUKUS was negotiated, and in a manner in which it was negotiated, it did raise certain concerns amongst allies of the US. Of course, Afghanistan was another factor which I think US withdrew without taking its Quad allies into cognizance. But all these things have been taken cognizance of, I think, after that the US needed to reassure, because there was actually a setback to US reputation and stature in the global community. And I think to that extent this meeting has been important. And what is important is that India has come out with certain very, very significant suggestions, especially Prime Minister Modi's suggestion of a common international protocol for travel and vaccination of COVID vaccines is a very, very significant movement, important step, because post-COVID, the way the movements have been curtailed has been having an adverse impact on economy, and I think if it is accepted, it will open up the travel, international travel, to a very great extent, and that would again trigger economy. On issues like climate change and vaccine, etc., the 4 Quad countries are in many cases looking at moving forward. Besides that, the new thing which has come up is the Quad fellowship, I think, which to my mind is a tokenism, but a significant tokenism, yes. That we realize that emergent technologies are important, and I think researches are important, and to that extent you are getting 25 students from all 4 Quad countries to come, and that fellowships will be granted so that they can study in top of the line universities, STEM universities in US, where they would probably move into the field of innovation and things like that. So this is what it is. I think more than the statement, it is the fact that this meeting took place and all 4 heads of government participated, and many of them are actually new into the post, and all 4 of them had never met each other in this position. Like Prime Minister Modi had not met any of the other 3 after they had taken over the position. In fact, the Japanese and Australian PM, he was meeting them for the first time, and even the US President, he had not met him personally ever since he had become the US President. His having met him earlier in different stature when he was a vice president is a different issue. But so this was a very, very important thing. I think from my point of view, I feel that this conference was far more significant from US point of view, because it needed to reassure its allies that it is still there and it will abide by its commitments. At the same time, I think we didn't want to raise any hackles, and that's one of the reasons why you have not seen any specific mention of any country. And of course, other leaders said a lot of things, like Australian Prime Minister talked about an open and free Indo-Pacific, and all these issues, the alliance of democracies, and President Biden talking of democratic values. So what all is required is actually a very clear indication that this alliance is going to be a strategic alliance of democratic countries. And I think it is going to go far beyond defense alone, as was the case with AUKUS. So it will have different aspects, and I think to that extent, I think this first such summit was extremely significant.
Right. Also, let's very quickly bring in thoughts from Mr. Subhamal Bhattacharjee also. He's there with us, and as a cyber expert, security expert. Sir, both the leaders in their bilateral meeting, they talked of critical technologies, they talked of cyber security, and also how Prime Minister Modi specifically talked of the 4 T's that bind the two countries together, and technology is a very important aspect that could further cement and strengthen the relation. So your reactions on that, and how long will technology help in, you know, further strengthening and cementing the ties between the two countries?
I think one of the hallmarks of Prime Minister Modi's governance in all these years has been the focus on technology.
Yes.
And it has not been an outright, bringing in every technology and not harnessing the capacity of the talents within the country. So and COVID was one of the most significant period of time when we saw the, usage of domestic technology along with whatever technological presence was there from many other countries. But having said that, the Indo-US relationship over all these years, in the last more than a decade has grown significantly in most of these strategic areas where technology plays a very important part. And steadily and very, very regularly, India is coming up the value chain in terms of its own, technology prowess as far as the global scene is concerned. Today, some of the cooperation, that happens with the US, it's centered around technology. And I think, this visit has once again highlighted the need to explore the future of technology, the focus on artificial intelligence, where 2 of the countries are talking on very specific stuff around artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how do you apply them to so many areas of functionality. The focus on 5G, that's going to be something, the focus on Internet of Technologies. Now, these are all areas where there is a lot of common grounds, where a large population in this country, where a large emerging digital citizens that are coming in the country need to be protected, need to be able to communicate in a secure atmosphere. So I think, the focus from R&D to application availability to usage and to the future, in all these 4 areas we are cooperating today. And even if you take it beyond the bilateral to the Quad, a very important aspect, as Ambassador Wadhwa and Mr. Bansal also mentioned, the critical technologies and how do you secure them in a world that is so much dependent upon secure chips and chip technology, and then data, which we say is the new oil or new water. These are 2 aspects that need so much of security, where cyber security becomes the enveloping concern for all of these nations. The strategic importance of cyber security from a national security point of view for all these 4 Quad countries, and as such the regional security, is being realized far much closely than anyone would have thought in the period of time in which this direction is going. The criticality of the supply chain around the chip technology and whatever computing ecosystem that we have already targeted that. And one of the very good steps is the announcements of these the scholarships also, because these are the ones that can harmonize a lot of the thinking towards a common ground in which we see that right at the inception we are able to factor in technology that is secure. Remember, this is a very, very dynamically evolving area, changes very fast, technology moves in a certain direction, and not necessarily everything can keep in pace. Now, if we are able to harmonize it at the level, and these 4 countries, the 4 Quad countries have been, very, very strong in terms of technology development and, the available talent and the human resource also, as far as, looking at harnessing technology in newer areas. So what the Prime Minister has done in the country, how he has, been embarking on and exhorting the youngsters to say that India should become a hub of cyber security, that is being put into practice, that is being put in that global context in such a nice manner that while we are able to bring in the best of the technology from others, we are also taking up our own technology, motivating our own talents in the country, blending all of that together and coming out with solution where not only we are creating job opportunities and taking care of the requirements at hand, but we are also looking at the future where our young workforce find newer areas to think beyond what is there in the horizon. So overall, I think this is a great visit.
Right, a great visit, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the Quad will work in the role of a force for global good, asserting that the cooperation among the 4 countries, including India, the United States, Australia and Japan in the group, will ensure peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister, in his opening remarks at the Quad leaders meeting, said that he expressed his gratitude towards President Joe Biden for the first in-person Quad meeting.
क्वाड एक तरह से फोर्स फॉर ग्लोबल गुड की भूमिका में काम करेगा। मुझे विश्वास है क्वाड में हमारा सहयोग इंडो पैसिफिक में और विश्व में शांति और समृद्धि सुनिश्चित करेगा।
First ever in-person Quad Summit, a new chapter of global welfare. Taking forward India's ancient philosophy of good for all, Prime Minister Modi said that he firmly believed that the grouping of 4 democracies would act as a force for global good and ensure peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific as well as the entire world. At the invitation of President Joe Biden, Prime Minister Modi and his counterparts Scott Morrison from Australia and Yoshida Suga from Japan met at the White House. Prime Minister Modi thanked US President Biden for calling the meeting. He said that the Quad vaccine initiative will greatly help the Indo-Pacific countries. Referring to shared democratic values, Prime Minister Modi said that the Quad group has decided to move forward with a positive thinking and positive approach.
अपनी साझा डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यूज के आधार पर क्वाड ने पॉजिटिव सोच, पॉजिटिव अप्रोच के साथ आगे बढ़ने का निर्णय लिया है। सप्लाई चेन हो या वैश्विक सुरक्षा हो, क्लाइमेट एक्शन हो या कोविड रिस्पांस या फिर टेक्नोलॉजी में सहयोग, इन सभी विषयों पर मुझे अपने साथियों से चर्चा करते बहुत खुशी होगी।
US President Joe Biden expressed confidence in a free and open Indo-Pacific region. He also said that the plan for global vaccination against COVID-19 is on track.
Our vaccine initiative is on track to produce an additional 1 billion doses of vaccine in India to boost global supply. And today, we're also launching a new Quad fellowship for students from each of our Quad countries to pursue advanced degrees in leading STEM programs here in the United States. It represents an investment in the leaders, innovators, and pioneers of tomorrow.
Prime Ministers of Australia and Japan also expressed their commitment to shared ties and a free and open Indo-Pacific region.
We believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific because we know that's what delivers a strong, stable and prosperous region, so our citizens, our peoples, can realise their hopes and dreams for their futures in a liberal and free society. The Quad is about demonstrating how democracies such as ours, as you said, Mr. President, can get things done.
This event demonstrates the strong solidarity between our 4 nations and our unwavering commitment to the common vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. The Quad is an extremely significant initiative by 4 countries who share fundamental values, cooperating for the cause of realizing a free and open international order based on the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific.
The first in-person summit-level Quad meeting marks a coming of age for the informal grouping. Frequent and regular high-level engagements will most likely be seen, and outcomes in areas like deeper cooperation on fighting climate change, cybersecurity, infrastructure development, and sharing of emerging technologies like 5G infrastructure will also materialize soon. Sudhakar Das in Washington DC for DD India.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden held the first ever in-person bilateral meeting. The delegation-level talks also were held, and Prime Minister Modi stressed on the importance of the third decade, in fact, in the bilateral relationship. He says that the US leadership will certainly play an important role in how this decade is shaped forward. Prime Minister also added that seeds have been sown for an even stronger friendship between India and the US.
The first ever in-person meeting between Prime Minister and President of two of the world's oldest and largest democracies. The venue, White House. The host, President Joe Biden. Prime Minister Narendra Modi received a warm welcome from President Joe Biden at the Oval Office. Both leaders hailed India-US ties and said they looked forward to beginning of a new chapter. Prime Minister Modi lauded President Biden's leadership, saying it will play a key role in shaping this decade. PM mentioned 4 T's: talent, technology, trade and trusteeship, and said both countries have the talent to leverage technology for greater global good.
दुनिया में सबसे ज़्यादा ड्राइविंग फोर्स बन रही है टेक्नोलॉजी। इस दशक में भारत और अमेरिका के रिश्तों में टेक्नोलॉजी, और वो भी पूरी मानवता के लिए उपयोगी हो, उस दिशा में हमारी टैलेंट टेक्नोलॉजी को माध्यम से बहुत बड़ी सेवा कर सकती है और एक बड़ा अवसर हमें उपलब्ध होगा।
Prime Minister described President Biden's efforts on COVID-19, mitigating climate change and the Quad as noteworthy. US President Joe Biden remembered Mahatma Gandhi a week ahead of his birth anniversary on October 2nd, recalling the values advocated by the Apostle of Peace and non-violence, tolerance, respect and human trusteeship.
भारत और अमेरिका के बीच ट्रेड का अपना महत्व है और इस दशक में ट्रेड के क्षेत्र में भी हम एक दूसरे को काफी पूरक हो सकते हैं। बहुत सी चीजें हैं जो अमेरिका के पास है, जो भारत को जरूरत है। बहुत सी चीजें भारत के पास है जो अमेरिका के काम आ सकती हैं। तो ट्रेड भी इस दशक का एक बहुत बड़ा क्षेत्र रहेगा।
The two leaders also held delegation-level talks. PM said both countries were committed to democratic values and traditions.
21वीं शताब्दी के तीसरे दशक का ये पहला वर्ष, मैं पूरे दशक की तरफ देख रहा हूं कि आपके नेतृत्व में जो बीज हम बोएंगे, इस पूरा दशक हमारी दृष्टि से बहुत ही भारत और अमेरिका के संबंध में, विश्व के लोकतांत्रिक देशों के लिए एक बहुत ही ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव ये कालखंड रहेगा, ऐसा मेरा विश्वास है।
US President Joe Biden recalled his long association with PM Modi, adding that India and the US are set to begin a new chapter in the history of bilateral ties, taking on some of the toughest challenges together.
And I think that's begun to come to pass, and today we're launching a new chapter in the history of US-Indian ties and taking on some of the toughest challenges we faced together, starting with a shared commitment to ending the COVID pandemic.
The meeting between the two leaders lasted for about an hour.
The partnership between India and the US is an enduring one, and it has a lot of room to grow as long as talent, trade, technology and trusteeship come together. And that is what was witnessed in the bilateral meeting, the first one between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and US President Joe Biden today at the White House. They talked about taking on challenges like COVID-19 and climate change and growing their relationship further into the future. With Cabinet Person Vinay Tiwari, this is Gautam Roy in Washington DC for DD India.
So a very significant bilateral meeting there, the first in-person bilateral meet since US President Joe Biden assumed office. Well, going across to you, Mr. Wadhwa, what do we understand from, he spoke about 4 T's, Prime Minister Modi spoke about 4 Ts as the big drivers of Indo-US relations in this new decade. What would you say we should understand from his mention of talent, if you could put it into context, the story so far in that regard and the road ahead from now on?
Well, I think as far as the T's are concerned, tradition, talent, technology, trade, and trusteeship that he referred to, and picking out talent from there, I think he specifically made a mention of the diaspora contribution in the United States. 4.2 million strong Indian diaspora is contributing a lot towards strengthening this relationship for a number of decades now. And this role has been continuously enhanced. You can see that happening in corporate America. You can see that happening in space program, the United States. In any walk of life where you'll find qualified Indian people contributing not only to nation building in the United States, but also then bringing on the talent to build bridges with India. We saw that on display on the first day of Prime Minister's engagements when the 5 CEOs of prominent technology companies and others who are important leaders in their own fields met with him. And they were effusive about what is happening in terms of the reforms that have been undertaken in India, and also very hopeful about taking this relationship forward on the basis of what India has to offer. Now, of course, we must remember that it's very important to connect corporate America with India for 2 main reasons. One is if India has to bring about a change in terms of its 5 trillion economy. Secondly, generating jobs in India and making sure that the share of GDP in India is raised from 14 to 15% of the GDP in manufacturing to about 25%. Then, of course, you need this connect. You need this technology infusion. Cutting-edge technology is very important for India to develop in the fields that it wants to, and ultimately to bring about a social change. And so the Prime Minister had this in mind in terms of the vast talent pool that India has. It needs proper skilling, nurturing, and that can only be brought about through guidance and directed manufacturing, which can only happen through skills and the talent and technology that can be brought about with contact with the outside world. So corporate America again plays a very important role in that.
All right, Mr. Bhattacharjee, when we talk of the fact sheet which has been put forth after the Quad meeting, it specifically talks how the Quad will publish a Quad statement of principles, establish technical standards, contact groups, added to that launch a semiconductor supply chain initiative, also support 5G deployment and diversification, and also monitor biotechnology scanning. Now, I would want you to explain to our viewers in simple layman's terms, what all has been put forth by the Quad leaders with regard to technology, critical technology, and also cyberspace security. How far will it benefit the nations in the longer run?
Definitely. It benefits all the nations in the longer run, but what we have to see is that in the shorter run, how these critical areas were chosen to be a part of the cooperation. Now, the focus on critical and emerging technologies has been there right from the inception, or rather I can say right from when the Quad became far much more active, and in the last 6 months, a lot of work has been really put on the ground by the diplomats from all these 4 countries to see that what is practically possible to be realized has to be worked out. Now, technical standards you just mentioned, as was there in this statement, it's very important that the operability of whatever we have in terms of technology or the usage of technology in the various devices and the ecosystem, they're able to seamlessly coordinate and function with each other and function in a secure manner. Very many times, many of these standards are found to be at variance, not only in defense, but even in non-defense areas. There are areas where we find that when it comes to coordinating seamlessly, it doesn't happen because somewhere a factor of security comes in, and somewhere the age-old system of performing the legacy that remains in that doesn't immediately allow a very seamless move towards a coordinated fashion of working. Now, this standard setting around using technology in the critical areas is a good step. It will not only bring a common ground together, but also try and look at things that might again become in some form of a hindrance or impactful in the future. Because once you look at the standards, you look at far much wider horizon in terms of what all we are looking. Secondly, supply chain of the whole computing industry today has become very, very important. It's something that you cannot think that everything can be done in a domestic fashion. That's why, despite an interest, it still takes a lot of time to build up the chips. Many of the manufacturing activities happen on the strength of economy of scale. So in some regions, the dependence on chip had become so much, and then in some of those places where those chips were being manufactured weren't really something that was seen to be giving that comfort of a foolproof 100% security. Now, so you wanted to make sure that everything today is kind of computer and chip dependent, and you have to ensure that what goes in your systems are protected. Even in our country, we have put in systems in place where a Bharat Electronics Limited or some organization of the government would ensure that what is going in those critical networks are correct in terms of their integrity. So now, if we are able to do that on a larger cooperation basis among the 4 countries, and mind you, all these 4 countries are countries that have been not only users of technology but have also had contribution in the overall IT ecosystem anywhere in the world. Japanese chip making capacity or Japanese work around technology is very well known. Americans have been the leaders in almost all areas. Australians have also contributed along around programming, and India by and large have been the programming resource of the whole world. So all of that taken together in securing this I think is a very, very important step, because ultimately it adds up to the overall cybersecurity picture. As I mentioned, cybersecurity per se is becoming one domain that nobody can ignore. The threats are varied. That threats even could be even internal threat, but the extent to which the external threats are emerging, evolving, and mutating, that is where you cannot allow any level of insecurity, any level of laxity to happen. So if we are able to first take off the chips at the manufacturing level and the supply chain and their integration into the network, and then subsequently get to the other end, the data that flows through all these networks and all, how do you secure the data? So I think this completes a far much larger function. That's where this whole thing looks at. And I would think that the leaders have already started looking into the future around some of the aspects in which a global order also comes in when you work around cybersecurity. Mind you that unlike nuclear and space, there is no real cooperation on the global scale as far as handling cyber instances are concerned. Today it is still on the MLATs and bilateral cooperation on which these are happening, and the transnational nature of these threats, where one cyber attack on a critical infrastructure in one of the Quad countries could have an footprints to about 5 or 6 countries. Now these are things where I think a Quad is the best forum to devise a strategy and some stringent measures towards a global policy. Mind you, the UN group of governmental experts have been working now for more than 2 decades, no real outcome comes. It's something, you have some practices that you offer, but it becomes, or it remains so much voluntarily, and we know the rogue nations around who are misusing them. So I think Quad has a far much larger role in this area also, to devise a global order around cybersecurity, when it comes to operations and usage.
Right. Mr. Bansal, while digitization featured in a big way throughout this visit of Prime Minister Modi, whether it was in his selection of CEOs that he met or in his addresses, digitization not just, or as you mentioned, in that joint statement, there is an underlying sense of intelligence sharing between the nations. It was not a concern not just of India but other countries. For example, everyone spoke of a resilient supply chain. When the Prime Minister in his 40s, he mentions technology as a driver of Indo-US ties. What are the aspects of technology that you feel he's talking about here?
See, as I said, I always believe that at this point of time, what India is looking to US is technology, and India has huge production capacities. It is in the interest of Quad that India emerges as a new economic hub to be in a position to counter China. And for that, we need technological inputs. And as Sobimal said, there are certain basic inherent weaknesses, and one of them is in the field of semiconductors. When he spoke to Qualcomm CEO, he wanted to have semiconductors manufacturing, and there was actually a certain statement of intent, yes, that the two are willing to collaborate to do that sort of a thing. And then, of course, he met Adobe CEO, who also happens to be an ethnic Indian, because in this whole visit, ethnic Indian part is also very, very important, because when he says talent, one of the important T's is talent. And when he says, Kamala Harris, that you are an inspiration to millions, it all actually is to showcase to the world that Indian diaspora has come of age. And in fact, it would not be wrong to say that Indo-US relationships have been a direct relation of Indian diaspora status in US. As Indian diaspora rose within the US, you have seen that India-US relationships have become closer and closer. So technology for India is of course very important. Intelligence sharing is just one part of it. India has also sought US assistance for screening of terrorists. Actually, the terrorist screenings, we have actually said that there should be a collaboration on terrorist screenings, which is actually important. US has certain advanced technologies which India would like to have. In fact, climate change has been a very important issue. So we need green technologies, India is going in a very, very big way as far as green technologies is concerned. Emerging technologies is the field where China had actually started posing a serious threat to the Western supremacy. So you need actually some place which could counter China, and that's sort of a space what all China has. I think similar facilities, similar market is available in India. And as far as these countries are concerned, India is the only ideal alternative to China. And I think to that extent, what Prime Minister Modi was also hinting was that a shifting of capital from China to India, because a large number of Western companies are invested in China, many of which want to relocate their production facilities to India. I think that is also he is looking at. So this is as far as technology is concerned. If you actually look at as a selection of 5 CEOs, that was very, very significant. In fact, apart from Blackstone, which is one of the largest investors in India, portfolio investors as well as other investors, he also met General Atomics Vivek Lal, again another ethnic Indian, and he talked of making India a hub of drone manufacturing. Of course, there is a defense angle where people are saying that we are about to buy 30 drones from Predator drones from US. But what is he's more interested in, if you look at PLI policy which came on drones, and the government of India's comprehensive policy on drones, coupled with this discussion, he's probably looking at making India as a hub of drone production. And in fact, that was discussed. So that is at one stage there. Then, of course, Adobe is a digital firm. He talked to Qualcomm. So technology and what technologies we need, semiconductors and all from US, is going to be a very important facet. I think one of the key focus areas for India would be, as far as chip making is concerned, semiconductors is concerned, because this is a key ingredient. And as Subimal said, we are dependent at this point of time on chips manufactured in other countries, which may have a serious security lacuna. You really don't know if they have certain built-in mechanisms which at certain later date and time could be used for snooping or other things. So you really do not know whether it is totally secure or not. For a country which aspires to be a global superpower, I think we should have the facility to manufacture our chips and semiconductors, and I think that's where it's very, very important.
All right, the Prime Minister will be addressing the 76th session of the UNGA today, and let's take that to Mr. Wadhwa. Mr. Wadhwa, we've been talking in detail about what could be taken up at the UNGA, but at the same time, if we specifically talk of terrorism, which indeed is an important issue, a binding issue at the UN, on one hand, India, in its right to reply, has slammed Pakistan for its malicious reference to Kashmir. And at the same time, on the other hand, we have US Vice President Kamala Harris taking suo motu, cognizance of terming Pakistan as a terror haven, and how terror emanating from Pakistan has to be stopped. Put all this together, how important is terrorism as an issue of common concern between India and US, and also when we talk of the priority areas for the UNGA, how will that be taken forward at UNGA as a forum?
Well, as far as India is concerned, terrorism and counter-terrorism, especially cross-border terrorism, has always been an important issue. And India is trying to push for a global convention on terrorism, as we all know, which is stuck still on the basis of definition of what constitutes terrorism. But nonetheless, I think that resolution commands a lot of support in the United Nations. And every year in the address, main address at the UNGA, India has been highlighting the concerns that we have of terrorism emanating from Pakistan and the issues of cross-border terrorism, financing for terrorism, and stopping the sources of financing for terrorism. So I'm sure, once again, Prime Minister Modi will be, including this in his address. The second major issue which has happened now since then is, of course, the issue of Afghanistan, where we have a sea change in the situation, and we have a radicalized Taliban regime controlled by Pakistan and the ISI, which has taken over that country. And obviously, it's in the common interest of United States, India, all the other democratic countries, the neighbors of Afghanistan, to make sure that Afghanistan's soil is not used as a base for launching of terrorism or terror attacks against the neighboring countries. And that is what came out quite clearly in that conversation with the Vice President of the United States and Prime Minister Modi, where, as you said, she suo motu referred to this aspect of making sure that the terrorist links of Pakistan had to be curbed, and that Pakistan had to be restrained from using these terrorist links to launch attacks and harming other countries in the world like United States and India. Third issue, of course, which is very important globally, is now become the issue of vaccines and the COVID-19 pandemic. You've seen that the Quad has come out with a very clear statement about making sure that they fight this scourge together, taking steps in that direction by rolling out vaccines for the Indo-Pacific, but also outlining steps about what they will do in terms of WHO, the 100-day mission on therapeutics, which they've come out with, and also making sure that they will keep pandemics on their radar going forward. So all this would be another feature which will be highlighted. Prime Minister Modi will definitely talk about the COVID certification being mutually acceptable throughout the world in order to ease travel to open out the world and to make sure that the countries who do not possess enough wherewithal are not discriminated against. And again, he will talk about vaccine equality. Fourth issue, in my view, which is very, very important again, is the question of clean technologies, which is related to climate change. And here he would certainly talk about the achievements of India, where we've taken the lead in the International Solar Alliance, for instance, the international resilience supply chains, which have become very important, and also the disaster management initiative, which India has again taken the lead in. And here, of course, the emerging critical technologies, digitization, which will help in this process and help generally the world in connecting itself and making sure that in this day of the pandemic, they can build back in a resilient manner.
Right, Mr. Bansal, we saw Quad emerging this time around at another time of crisis. The last time it was evident as a grouping, as a power, as a force, was during the 2004 tsunami. That's what analysts say. And now also, as the world moves out of the COVID crisis and we have the crisis in Afghanistan, we see Quad emerging again. In that sense, do you feel that this changed world scenario, it will be present in the address that the Prime Minister will make later today at the UN General Assembly?
I'm not sure if he would be talking about Quad, but these challenges, I think, would be included in his General Assembly speech, because COVID is, of course, a global threat, and how these countries have come together to counter COVID. The manner in which India has ramped up its production of vaccines, the new vaccines that have actually come up with in India, and from 1st October, India is actually giving that sort of vaccines to the global community for vaccination. I think that all the India's attempts to vaccinate the global community would, I think, be highlighted. And Afghanistan is, of course, a very, very important issue, and I think Prime Minister in his speech should lay down India's expectations from Afghanistan. We have talked about inclusive government, we have talked about government where women have the right to work, etc., which Taliban is never going to go. And we also need to understand which issue is that the current ruling dispensation in Kabul does not seem to be a free and an independent dispensation. And I think we have always said Afghan-led, Afghan control, but it seems to be at this point of time, the ruling dispensation in Afghanistan seems to be ISI led and ISI controlled. So with that sort of a thing, I think we would, Prime Minister would want to address the UNGA about Afghanistan and the dangers of such ideological states which could actually propagate terrorism across the globe. Because we need to understand that Taliban is wedded to an ideology, and a state governed by that sort of an ideology could become a safe haven for terrorists of all shades and hue. All radical elements could take shelter and then propagate their ideology across international borders.
Right, we are just about come to the end of our show. Subhimal, we'd like you to tell us something about your thoughts, even as all eyes will be on the Prime Minister's address at the UN General Assembly.
I think, as Alokji also just mentioned, the vaccine story in India is a great story of leadership as well as, work for humanity. And let me tell you again, there is a huge technology element to the whole vaccine story that has happened in the country, and we need to propagate that too, because the pace at which the genome sequencing was done with the help of, high power computing, I think, and then the pace at which we started manufacturing, then delivering, and now today, the way we are vaccinating people across the country, it's a huge country with a huge population, it's going in a very methodical way, and the application of technology right from the vaccine manufacturing to a co-win based distribution and involvement. I think it's a great case study for many nations. A democratic nation based on the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam has actually showed to the world when it came to the need to deliver on something that no one of us knew anything about. Here India has shown. And so the technology aspect of what we did around the vaccine ecosystem in the country for COVID-19, I think is something that we need to tell to the world. And most importantly, India's emergence as a global leader, harnessing technology as a positive aspect, that's always a message the Prime Minister has been giving. That's where I think we always would like to still continue our progress and things.
All right, so we leave it at that. Thank you so much, all three of you, Mr. Anil Wadhwa, Mr. Alok Bansal and Mr. Subimal Bhattacharjee, for joining in with your inputs on DD India in the special broadcast Prime Minister's visit to the USA. So that was the panel discussion we had. When we talk of Prime Minister's visit to the US, detailed discussion wherein we touched upon and we elaborated on the first leg of the visit of Prime Minister in the US in Washington DC, and also what are the expectations of the session, 76th session, which he will be addressing today at the UNGA.
With that, it's a wrap on this special presentation. We hope you enjoyed our show. Meanwhile, news and updates continue on DD India. So do stay tuned. Namaskar.
Namaskar.